Hello, global gardeners. You know what time it is. It's Monday. It's time to start your gardening week with this fantastic community we have from all over the world. Guten Tag to Christian from Germany, who I saw checking in a few minutes ago. It's so fantastic to see everybody. And of course, thank you to Jay and Heidi, our fantastic moderators, as we get started. We have a special guest today. Let's go ahead and welcome Cameron Akrami, who is on the Busy Gardener YouTube channel. So, not sure how many of you know Cameron, but today he's here. How are you doing, Cameron?
So good today. I'm fighting a little bit of a sore throat, so I've got my coffee. That does the trick.
That's okay. I've got my tea. I'm always battling those kind of issues as well. So, today, not only do I want to introduce you all to the Busy Gardener, but it's a great channel with great information and a focus on fruit trees. So that's going to be our focus today on the fruit trees. But of course, we'll be answering your questions and talking about a lot of other things because you've got a lot of videos, Cameron, beyond just the fruit trees. But why don't you share with us why that is one of your primary focuses?
Yeah, thanks, Scott. The fruit trees started just as a passion project, just planting fruit trees to begin with. It was 11 years ago, almost exactly. We were waiting for our second child to be born, and I watched this YouTube video just on a whim by Tom Spellman of Dave Wilson Nursery.
Yeah.
And he was saying, hey, he was showing how you can do backyard orchard culture, as he calls it, where you do high density planting. And in the space of one tree, you can plant multiple trees and have successive ripening. And literally, I watched the video and I told my wife, hey, I'm going to a nursery. I'll be back. We hadn't planted really anything before that. I came back with 10 fruit trees and planted them in this space kind of on the side of our yard, and had really just been growing trees. And I really loved it and was watching all of these videos online. And several years later, I realized how much I loved it. We planted a much larger orchard, and I realized how big an impact those videos made on instructing me. And I wanted to make content like that for people who were going down that similar road because I had so many questions.
So you have a pretty good sized yard, and I want to talk about gardening on a slope because my first real garden, I had to terrace and do a lot of what you're doing. How much space do you have? How many fruit trees are you actually growing on that?
So fruit producing plants, we have something around 80. And
Yeah.
so when I say plants, most of them are trees. So I think last count maybe 55 trees or so, 60 trees. And then that includes, then on top of that, I've got some blueberries and some other vining things, caning things like berries. But yeah, with the space we're on a half-acre lot. So we've got a
Okay.
nice sized lot here in
Yeah.
Southern California. But the first planting, I planted 9 trees in the space of really where a single car would fit. And so I really I really implemented the principles that work for people with any kind of growing space. If you've got a small, tiny 10-foot by 10-foot space, that's what I started with. We didn't start planting the big 5,500 square foot orchard. We did it in a 10 by
Okay.
15 square foot space.
And so for others who want to follow the same basic type of culture, what are some of the important principles? And so when you're putting that many trees into a given space, what are some of the things that we should consider as we approach that?
Well, when you're planting in a high density type setting, pruning is going to be the main way that you control your tree size. So if you want to plant a tree and never ever go back to it, then this high density planting is not for you.
Right.
So sometimes people will look and say, well, I'm just going to buy a dwarf tree and I'm not going to have to worry about it. I can just plant a bunch of dwarf trees. But something that isn't really understood is that a fully grown, let's say, apple tree is 30 feet tall, left to its own on a regular rootstock. A semi-dwarf is like 23 feet tall. And a dwarf apple tree left to grow on its own gets 18 feet tall. And so the idea that you're going to have a dwarf apple tree and just plant a bunch of things, it doesn't quite work like that. So I think just recognizing that it's going to take more input than it would if you just had a tree out somewhere that you never ever touched. But it's also can be it's a very slow. It's not like vegetable gardening where you have to be very attentive every single day. There's a lot of wiggle room. That's one reason why I call my channel The Busy Gardener, actually,
Right.
is that I'm a busy guy. I've got 5 kids. I run a business. And so this was a thing that made it possible to just plant stuff and not have to be on it every single minute. So I think some first principles are figuring out what kind of trees you want. You want them to be, sometimes you've got some compatible, some need to be pollinated by similar plants.
Right.
That's something that I've also known some people really get in trouble for. So there are a few steps in terms of like from the planting stage, you want to make sure that you've got water going to it. You want to make sure that you're choosing a right type of plant or tree, especially for your climate. Not every tree works in every climate. You can't grow an orange outdoors in Minnesota.
Or in Colorado.
Or in Colorado. Or even in some parts of California. So, but on the same token, the things you can grow in Colorado that get enough chill hours, that require enough chill hours to produce fruit, won't really grow well in our climate.
Oh yeah, we're growing pear and apple varieties here that
easily all day long
be able to grow. Yeah.
Yeah.
So let's talk a couple of those things. Those are great tips, and so I want to reiterate the idea. Then I think a lot of people don't fully understand that when we are buying a tree, in almost all cases, the trees we put into our garden have a root stock that is different than the type of tree that we're growing, and they've been grafted together at the nursery. And I started as well watching Dave Wilson videos when I've only got a dozen trees in my little mini orchard in the back. But the root stock, you're right, it's a common misconception that if I plant a root stock, and I think some of the nurseries kind of continue this mythology because they'll say, oh yeah, this tree only grows 6 to 8 feet tall. The root stock is just one of the factors that will determine the overall size of the tree. I actually do some espalier where I'm using semi-dwarf stock, but I'm pruning the tree to stay very small. And it's not something that you just stick in the back of your yard and walk away from and expect that's going to be the end of it. And so as we choose the trees we have, here's another very common question. I'm sure you've seen this many times from Melissa. Is it true I have to have multiple apple trees of different varieties to get fruit?
Melissa, the answer is it depends. So there are 3 kind of camps, okay? There are those fruit that are truly self-fruitful and can produce without any other input, just from themselves. They'll get pollinated within the plant itself. And so you want to let me just even back up further. If you look on the tag, generally a tag will say whether it's self-fruitful or not. So there are some that are fully self-fruitful. They don't need any additional input. Then there are some that are considered self-fruitful, but will benefit from a compatible pollinator. And apple trees are a lot like this. I'm thinking of my Anna apple that does grow really well here in Southern California, a nice warm weather apple. And Anna is self-fruitful, but will give a heavier crop when paired with a compatible pollinator. So that's the answer to that. There are some, however, that absolutely require a compatible pollinator in order to give you any fruit. And that means a different type of fruit that's of a similar species. So it really depends on the variety that you're talking about. And you'll want to check the tag, or honestly, davewilson.com is fantastic for letting you know what types of pollinators are compatible pollinators for a particular fruit.
Absolutely. Now, one of the things I grew one when I was growing at the school garden that I was running, because grafting is such a big part of the fruit tree industry. You get these novelty trees that have 4 different fruits on the same tree or 8 different types of apples, and they'll promote that as self-fruiting because you essentially have different types of trees that are growing on the same trunk. Do you do any of that?
I have one, so that's like a multi-grafted or a multi-budded tree, they call it. And I have one like that. I didn't buy it for the cross-pollination. I bought it. It's a pear tree. It's a 4-in-1 pear tree. And the concept makes a ton of sense. I don't like that method for choosing a tree, largely because you really only have one branch of any kind of fruit. So imagine you've got one branch, one stalk here, one trunk. And then you've got multiple individual, which way am I going here? Multiple individual branches, and every one of these pencils is another kind of fruit. And so if that one branch gets compromised somehow, then that entire type of fruit is done. I think that you can accomplish the same thing with planting 3 trees within 1.5 to 2 feet of each other and get the same effect, but you have way more production. You've got multiple branches. And so, yeah, if somebody only had room for a single tree, I would go for something like that, a multi-budded tree. But I think that most people are going to be happier if they have just a little bit of space to plant 3 or even 4 trees in that same space rather than going the multi-budded route.
Yeah, I completely agree with you. Here in Colorado with our harsh winters, I can't think of a time that my trees have made it through the winter with all of the branches intact. And so the idea that I would be growing a single variety on that one branch, and that's the branch that gets destroyed by the windstorm or the hailstorm or the ice storm, I would much rather have multiple trees. And it allows you with the pruning, as we were talking earlier, pruning isn't such an important aspect of keeping your trees under control that half your tree becomes rampant just because that's one of the varieties that grows faster than the other side. I think you really have to be careful. So when you talk about planting the trees 2.5 feet apart, you're really trying to get this area filled with fruit. The common understanding when we're planting our vegetables is we don't want to put our plants too close together, because they'll rob each other of nutrient and it's going to affect the harvest. But it doesn't necessarily work that way. So explain why you can put trees so close together when you're using a high density planting.
That's exactly right. This is one of the most common questions I've gotten over the years is how close is too close? Yeah. And I think it comes with resetting your understanding and expectation for what a backyard grower is doing. All of the conventional wisdom has to do with what a commercial grower is trying to accomplish, where they have one type of fruit in long rows where they can just come through in one shot and pick all of them, have a huge harvest, send it off to market, and then wait until the next year. But the backyard grower like you and me we don't want 900 apples at one time. We want 50 apples a week for a couple of months. Yeah. And so the idea here is there's a bit of a trade-off in production. There's a bit of a trade-off in terms of, the volume of harvest. So where you may have had just one plant, again, I was talking about one tree in one space. Let's say it's a plum. I plant a Santa Rosa plum here, and if I just let it grow by itself, I could have 500 plums. And they're all going to be ripe within a 1.5 or 2 week span. And either I'm picking them or they're ending up on the ground within that span of time. Well, if I take that idea and instead of just planting that one Santa Rosa plum, plant next to it a flavor grenade pluot and an emerald drop pluot, those are all pollinating each other. So I'm getting better yields. And it's true that instead of it being one tree that has, again, the Santa Rosa is up here, if next to them I planted 3, I'm pruning them and treating each of those trees as almost like a branch of that of a single tree. So you're treating the multi-planting like a single tree and you're pruning it like that, but you're getting what's called successive ripening. And so by planting them close, you're getting cross-pollination and you're getting a smaller yield. So maybe that Santa Rosa that would have given us 500 before, maybe we only get 150 plums.
Which is a lot.
Which is a lot. It's an awful lot of plums. That's a lot of jam. But then the one next to it, that's going to be for those couple of weeks. But then 2 weeks later, 3 weeks later, the emerald drop pluot is going to be ready, and that's going to give you 150 plums. And then a couple of weeks after that, the flavor grenade pluot is going to give you 150 plums. So you're spreading out, you're extending the growing season in the same physical space. So you're not having to do full size trees. You're able to get a lot more variety within that same amount of space by using this method. So it's different. The backyard grower has different objectives.
Yeah. Yeah, and another factor, and this is one of those things I remember when I went through the Master Gardener training 20 years ago, that tree roots, and a lot of it depends on your environment, but they extend out beyond the drip line. It's a myth that a lot of people, or a lot of gardeners don't ever understand. They think that all of the roots are growing directly beneath the branches, and the drip line is the edge of those branches. But particularly like here in a dry region like I have, Colorado State University did some studies and found that most of the trees that are growing in our area, the roots can extend out 10 times the height of the tree.
Wow.
Because they're looking for water. We're dry, and whenever it's wet, those roots are venturing out. You right now are probably being inundated by rains and snow and all the other things that are hitting California. But that's a big factor. Even if we have those fruit trees growing close together, all of their roots are not staying in a nice little bundle underneath the branches. So we can take advantage of the space we have, because there might only be one sunny spot in our yard that's ideal for the plants, but the roots don't need sun. They can venture out into those shady spots and into those other areas. And so as you are gardening on a slope, and you've got some, of course, problems associated with that, how are you anticipating the root growth as you terrace and put the different plants in your garden?
The slope is something that actually has been a work in progress. And so we've pivoted pretty hard. We had a slope that was causing a ton of erosion. So to clarify kind of and just give a little bit of how our property is set up. In the front, we have a pretty flat, we were calling our test orchard, the space of really one car that has a number of fruit trees in it, including an espaliered pomegranate. And then in our
nice.
main orchard, which is the 5,500 square foot one, that has a very gentle slope. And then that dropped off into a very severe slope that was eroding seriously onto our patio. And we took on a project. So the most recent videos of ours would show that we've actually terraced that back. We've pushed it back and have terraced those into raised growing beds. And we're intending not actually to grow fruit trees in those beds.
Okay.
And we're wanting to devote that, instead of having a small square foot garden down below, we're anticipating making that not a square foot garden, but just a vegetable garden and a vegetable and flower garden. So our fruit trees are up on top on a fairly flat area, because growing fruit trees on a slope, just like any kind of gardening, is really challenging. We found that out even trying to grow grass on that slope, which is why we ended up terracing. We tried 4 times to grow grass. So it's hard because erosion plays such a role, and water runoff is such an issue. If somebody were to grow on a slope, and the couple of spots that we have, using something to create a little bit of a terrace or a little bit of a step so that you can plant in it is really ideal, whether you use some sort of retaining wall bricks, or they've got a thing called dirt locker, which are, I think they're kind of a plastic stair step thing that allow you to kind of just create levels, because those levels are going to alleviate a lot of the problems with runoff, with irrigation kind of going awry. Yeah, planting you've got to be brave. And sometimes when I'm driving down to San Diego, I see all of the avocado orchards that are planted on a hill, and I'm just thinking, man, how are they making that work? Because erosion in a hill can just be so difficult.
Yeah. I had that problem with my last house. I actually had a steeper slope than you have. And I spent almost 2 years just creating the retaining walls and trying to level the ground above it. Now, and this will lead into our next question, I did have it all measured out. I knew exactly what the level was going to be. I knew how high the retaining wall was going to be. And I went ahead and planted a plum tree and an apple tree on the slope, but I covered the roots to the level that I knew the final level was going to be. And I knew it was going to take me a while to build the retaining wall, but I wanted to get those fruit trees in. And so here's a question from Connie. I have 2 loquat trees that are about 4 years old now. They've never flowered. How old before they start bearing fruit?
Connie, I'm not sure about loquat trees in particular. This is another common question. I planted it. When do I get my fruit?
Yeah.
So there are a couple of factors. 3 factors maybe that jump to mind. The first is time. Every type of tree takes longer or shorter depending on the type of tree that it is. Stone fruit, I've noticed fruit really quickly. Avocados can take 5 years, in some cases 7 years sometimes, depending on how small the tree was to begin with. So the age of the tree matters a whole lot. Another thing that matters is whether or not, again, you have compatible pollinators. I think loquats are self-fruitful. And another issue has to do with just environmental things. Are they stressed? Are they getting enough water? Are they getting too much water? Are they being fertilized? And so give it a little bit of time. I don't think 4 years is quite, the jury's still out. So give it a little bit of time and see if you get some fruit.
Yeah, and Amy says that their loquat was about 7 years old when they got to that point. But that's why I prefaced by saying I put my fruit trees in years before I had my terracing done, because I knew it was going to take that long. And I was actually lucky. I think I got my first fruit on that plum tree at about year 3.
Wow.
And the terrace had been done for a year. So it was one of those things that anticipating and doing the engineering and the planning and the measuring and the leveling actually paid off, because I could finally sit back and not have to work anymore. And I make a lot of jams and jellies, and the plum jam from your own tree is just fantastic. It's
the best. Seriously, one of the tastiest ever.
And so are you doing that kind of preservation as well?
We've done some preservation. You know, the trees. Okay, so I mentioned I have 5 kids. A lot of the fruit gets taken off and just eaten fresh. And so when we have, especially on our Santa Rosa plum, there's a lot of production. So we've done some. We have made Santa Rosa, plum jelly. We've made pomegranate jelly. We've made boysenberry jam and blackberry jam, which has been really good. But outside of that, we're eating a lot of it fresh and giving a lot of our fruit and produce away. But it's the nice thing about preserving it is being able to come back later when stuff isn't being productive and still enjoying those flavors.
Absolutely. Jillian is asking, I'm still struggling with birds and my fruit trees. So I'm sure you don't have a single bird that comes into your garden. No pests at all. But what would you suggest to Jillian?
Jillian, birds are, I made a video on birds, and the blanket thing is this: birds don't want to go where they're going to be eaten. So if you can give them the idea that they might be eaten by something, or something that's just weird or uncertain, they will generally stay away. There are a couple of points that I think are helpful. One is they have these bird nets that they will sometimes, advocate and say, hey, put a big bird net around your tree. I found that messes with the foliage. So the couple of things that I've done have been building a kind of a little stand that has some dangly things on it, just using some conduit. And so I use some bird tape that flaps and flutters in the wind, and I keep that offset from the tree. And I have a couple of these stands that are offset, and so that's nice because they don't get tangled in the tree themselves. Mm-hmm. Like as sometimes people hang CDs inside a tree, but I've found that will just get tangled in the tree and stops being effective. So I like having a couple of stands that are off of the tree a little bit. The birds see the fluttering and they will sometimes stay away from it because they see a glint. And then the nice thing about that is I can just kind of move that around to the trees that are in danger of being pecked. So as things are ripening, I'm moving these things closer to those trees. So I think the birds are very, very visual. So I think keeping something that's moving is really a key thing to kind of scaring them off. A stationary owl is not going to cut it. There are countless pictures of those owls with bird droppings on
birds perched on. Yeah. I've actually started, and I think it's working pretty well, using spinners. So like garden art, the big ones that are like 6 feet off the ground. And I have a pretty good sized one around my fruit trees. And now my trees are still young enough. This is going to be year 3, and I'm crossing my fingers to actually maybe start getting some fruit. But I've noticed in the couple areas where I have the large wind spinners and I get a lot of wind, that's helping to keep the birds away. I like birds in my garden. I've got the water feature. I've got the bird boxes. I have bird feeders, and I'm enticing them to that area of my garden and trying to discourage them through the wind spinner. So it's the same idea. It's that movement, and it's not foolproof, but it helps.
You're just trying to minimize the pressure. The worst birds all of these pests can be tough, but I know birds, it's hard because I love all of those things too. I love all of the woodland creatures, but once they start eating, we look at this fruiting with such anticipation that when you come out and see half of your crop just pecked, and they don't even eat the whole thing. They're like little kids. They just take a bite and then they move on to the next one.
Yeah, I had some success, and I still do with peach trees in this area. But at a garden almost 20 years ago, I was growing a stone fruit like that, and our winters are so harsh, and we get late spring freezes, and the tree will be covered with blossoms, and then the freeze hits, and nothing fruits that year because it's just so heartbreaking. But one year I had 5 fruit after a spring with all of the flowers, and then we had the late freeze, and some of those inner fruits were beginning to form, and I had 5 on this tree, and I was so looking forward to it, and I was babying it, and came out and was kind of pinching it, and I can remember verbalizing, talking to myself outside, saying, tomorrow I'm going to come back and harvest this fruit. And I came back in the morning, and of course, you guessed it, they'd all been eaten by the birds. So,
Scott, and they know, the birds know, they've seen your
Exactly.
calendar, they know when you're going to pick them. And it's always the day before you're going to pick them.
Exactly. So, with that thought in mind, I've learned over the years that if I'm going to harvest tomorrow, I harvest today.
That's exactly. Say, I'm
and so
going to be
what
out there tomorrow, but then
That's right.
do it
So,
early.
so how do you determine the right time to harvest your trees with either birds in mind or how you're going to use it? How about some tips on how we can tell when the fruit is ripe?
The the pest issue can be really hit or miss. It's really unpredictable at times, and so I don't actually base it at all around pests. I generally just base the harvest time on how the fruit tastes. That's one nice thing about being a backyard guy is you can go out, pick one fruit, and go, oh, these. You just start to develop an idea of just looking at it or feeling it on what ripe looks like, and then I just base it on that. I don't want to pick immature fruit and just pull it all down and then taste it and realize, oops, these aren't ready yet. So I'll do a lot of tasting just to at least get in the ballpark, know what ripe is, and I might pick some slightly immature fruit if I'm going through and we're going to make a jelly or something like that. But I really enjoy going out and just honing the taste and honing what a ripe Santa Rosa look like, what a ripe orange looks like, and seeing how the color plays and what to look for. So that's really what drives a lot of what we do because we're not having to do it in one shot. We can do it over an extended period of time.
Absolutely, and it's enjoyable to pull a fruit off the tree and taste it, and especially if it's not ripe, it's an educational experience to eat an unripe fruit. And like you say, you learn to do it in time. So Moondust is asking, how often would I have to paint the base of the apple tree? Now, Charles Malky was on the show a couple of weeks ago from IV Organic, and I know you know Charles, and I did a video on painting my trees. I got a big problem with sun scald here, but need to paint the trees. Are you painting your trees?
Yeah, in fact, that's how Charles and I got acquainted because he saw a video and he saw that my trees were painted. He says, okay, so how did you know about this? Because his whole thing has been educating people on the need for this. And for me, I think I saw that originally from Tom Spellman with Dave Wilson Nursery, I think was painting the trees. So we do have an issue, especially with our subtropical trees here getting burned, like our avocados, especially, and sometimes our citrus. So, but all of the trees will benefit from that type of protection. So you definitely want to paint a tree. When you say the base of a tree, Moondust, I'm talking about really what would be called like the heart of the tree, which is the trunk going all of the way up, and any of the interior branches that are going to be your scaffolding. You don't need to get every single little branch that is tickling off if you can't. Right. But I think keeping that heart painted, it definitely when you plant it, because a young tree is the most sensitive tree. It's the most at risk because it grew up kind of in a canopy of all of its neighbors, in the nursery, and then you remove that and put it out in the open, and it can be really sensitive. So I would paint it upon planting, and then I think annually. I think every winter, depending on what you've got the danger of. If sun scald is a thing, then you want to plant it, before that happens. So probably in the fall, but generally keeping a coat on there, kind of like applying sunscreen. When you see that it's kind of degrading a little bit, put another coat of whitewash on there.
Yeah, and I completely agree. That's a good suggestion. And the fall is when I paint my trees going into the winter. And I was just out this weekend looking at the trees to see how they made it through the winter. And if you notice spots that are going to be exposed to the sun, then go ahead and give a touch up on the paint. And the Ivy Organic is a good material because you really can't do too much. It's permeable and it breathes. And so putting some on top of what's already there is really not a bad thing. And it's better to, it's like sunscreen. That's a good analogy. It's better to put on too much sunscreen
That's right.
than to not put on enough. You'll definitely notice the differences. And so Mark's asking me if I've looked into growing citrus in 5B using a hardy rootstock. And so, and I'll let you throw in your thoughts as well. I have looked into that. There's not a lot of citrus that are hardy to zone 5B, even with the rootstock, because while we were talking rootstock earlier, there's a lot more to it than the rootstock. You know, that apricot tree I was talking about with the blossoms being frozen off by a late spring freeze, or a lot of the other fruit trees that I've grown that have the buds just starting to develop, and then we get a freeze and it kills the bud, and so now there's fewer leaves and definitely no fruit. And when it comes to citrus, do you have suggestions to me of whether I could grow citrus in 5B?
Let me tell you, you're steel yourself for the tears that are going to come when you come out to your dead citrus. 5 is truly. Look, I'm weighing whether or not to plant citrus in zone 8B, and thinking that probably is not going to work. And so it truly is a fool's errand, I think, to do it in zone 5, unless you're planting it in a container that you wheel in for the winter. That's really the only option. Or if you have some sort of greenhouse that you can put it under. You know, the biggest thing is this: it's not the sustained cold that's the issue. It's the frosty cold. If it gets down into the 20s at all, then your trees are in danger of having tissue damage and death. And so, our home, actually, we were built here on citrus groves. This was all lemon groves where I live. And they would come out and they would be listening to the weather report. And if it was going to be under 29 is usually like the danger zone. And they would come out and they'd light these fires to create kind of a smog layer, even here, even in zone 10B. And so I think 5 or 10A, 10A, 9B. So I think 5 is, unless you're going to move it indoors, really 8 and up is where you're going to get consistent citrus fruiting. Sorry, Mark.
Yeah, and you're exactly right. So I have looked into the possibility of growing in containers to then bring those containers in. My problem is I have no south-facing windows in my house. And so I've tried growing citrus indoors, but I just can't get them or give them enough light for them to grow well indoors. So even though I could put them in a container outside, I've got nowhere to put them once I bring them indoors. So I've just kind of written off citrus. But you're exactly right. That's an option, is to containers outside, containers inside, containers outside, and just be a busy gardener moving your plants back and forth all the time. And so Brian is saying that he has the mylar ribbons, and they keep the woodpeckers off of the house. And so I've done mylar low down in some of my fruit bushes, but I haven't done them in the trees themselves. So that should work. I've done the CDs, so those of us who have a lot of CDs that we have no use for anymore. After a time, though, I don't know if you've had this problem, they actually separate. They actually peel apart.
It flakes off.
Yep. And they're no longer shiny.
It's so disappointing. This is, the trial and error is so interesting when you've put something out and then you go out and you think that you've got this passive thing that's working for you in your orchard or by your fruit trees, and then you come out and you realize the fruit is all gone. The thing you put out there is all wrapped up in the branches and has not been spinning for the last 3 months.
Yeah.
And they're no longer shiny.
That's right. So Bud's got a good question, and this gets back to Dave Wilson and why you were watching the videos and why I was watching the videos. Advice that you can give on pruning back a tree that got too big. Let's say you were growing that dwarf tree or that semi-dwarf tree and didn't expect it to get so big. How do you hack or really cut back a tree that's grown to the point that you have to get it back under control?
That's a hard one because when you realize that it's out of control, sometimes you're a little too far down the road. When it comes to pruning, when you're trying to bring back the canopy of a fruit tree that has gone too tall and you're wanting to establish lower growth, that is, you have to do that over a few seasons because there's only so much of the tree canopy that you can reduce at any given season without stressing the tree. And so let's say it takes you really don't want to take off more than a quarter, maximum a third of the overall canopy of the tree in any growing season, generally speaking. And so you would have to split that up over a few years. Something that is often recommended, especially for trees that are not especially long-lived, like stone fruit, so it depends on the type of tree that it is you only have so many productive years anyway. And so sometimes the common wisdom on this is just to start over with the new tree that you can shape in the direction that you want to go, because you're going to sacrifice all of your fruiting for the next 3 years. Well, you can have a new tree in that space that's pruned and shaped in the way that you want it. It's going to be fruiting in about the same amount of time. And you kind of restart the clock on productivity as well, depending on the type of tree.
Great answer. I completely agree, and was hoping you would say some of those magic numbers like 1/3 of the tree in 3 years, because that's exactly it. It's a 3-year process if you want to try to get the tree under control. And when you get it under control, those lower branches that are remaining are probably not the most productive fruiting branches. And so now you've got this tree that's under control, and the next question will be, why isn't my tree giving me any fruit? And so, yeah, I completely agree. It's so hard to kill plants and to cut back that tree. And maybe you can cut it back. I've got a willow tree in my backyard that is, I thought it was dead and it kind of came back. We had some just severe cold a few years ago that just devastated the trees in our whole area. And my neighbor behind me took out 12 trees because there was so much damage. They just had to take the tree out. And so what I'm doing with this willow tree is keeping it, trimming off most of those outer dead branches, but I'm keeping it for the owl that I have in my yard. And we also have hawks that come in the neighborhood. And so this is one of those things, it's on that side of my garden near my fruit trees. And I welcome the owl to come in and the hawks in that area of the yard without any problem. So
yeah, because there are no sparrows sitting on their heads. They're
right.
actually doing something.
That's right. So depending on the size of the tree, if it's out of control and you don't want to cut it down, there are other options. Turn it into a focal point, hang garden art from it. But I agree with you completely. Starting over is often the best answer. It's just the hardest one to actually do. So Douglas is saying, I have poor soil conditions. Do I need to amend the soil to grow fruit trees? And thanks, Douglas. I'm glad you love the channel. I love it too. So amending your soil, how do you approach that?
I don't amend it.
Great answer. I just love your answers. You do it the same way I do it.
Yeah, it's hard because there's this common perception of different things, and we intuit that certain things would happen. You think, oh, my tree will be happiest if I put a bunch of amended soil in it, because that's what they need. They need nutrients, and this soil has no nutrients. And so how about I put that in? The problem is unless you're going and changing the entire area where the roots would ever go, you're only really amending a small place. And you what you want is your tree to explore and you want those roots to go out looking for nutrition. And so if you amend that small area that you're planting in, those roots are not going to want to go out from there. You want it to go out. So that's kind of a major reason. I know it's hard. I'm just even thinking, I was down with Kevin Espiritu of Epic Gardening. We were planting a citrus tree. And I said, okay, now Kevin, you don't put any soil amendments. And then he's just looking at me. And I said, and you don't fertilize your tree immediately after planting either. And he didn't do it in the video, but then he admitted to me later that he went and fertilized it. I was like, hey, it's your tree, man. You can do what you want. But there's such a tendency, I want to give it what it needs. But the tree, what the tree needs is to acclimate to the actual area that it's in. And so you can do a lot. And I'm going to just talk about this, Scott, for a second, if possible.
Go for it.
If you have poor soil, it's not by amending it that especially when it comes to trees that are a long prospect. It's not, if veggies, go for it, put them in something very rich. But a tree, you want to establish and create an environment that tree is going to thrive for many, many years. And so there are some ways you can do that. One of those is putting mulch over the top of it. That's a real helpful thing. It's going to create a lot of beneficial things going on beneath the soil. The soil health is going to go up. And then also, as you fertilize over the top of that tree, those things are going to go down into the soil, and you're going to enrich the soil that way in some respects. And so that's kind of a little bit of a long answer. Don't amend it when you first plant it, but you want to create an environment that over the long haul is going to really be beneficial for that tree.
Oh, absolutely. And that's the exact approach. That's why I said perfect answer, because that's exactly what I'm doing. And so I love it when other gardeners who know what they're talking about can substantiate what I'm doing. And so in the area where I've got my dozen fruit trees, my soil is terrible. I did a video, of course, that shows how I planted. I did not amend the hole at all. But I've got 6 inches of wood chip mulch over that entire area. Not just around the trees, but the entire area. And in my very dry environment, I've gone in August, and we've had no rain for 6 weeks, and the soil is still moist underneath that mulch.
It's shocking.
It's incredible. And then to actually dig into the soil, and just after a year, recognizing that the top few inches is already better than it was. And as you say, it's a long-term way to approach it, but that's what you have to do. You have to look at it as not just a planting hole like we would put a tomato in the ground. The tree roots are extending out so far that we need to look at the entire space. And so you did a video recently where you were talking about doing the different layering of the plants. And I didn't see you mention permaculture in that video, but that's a common aspect of permaculture where we're planting different size plants in and around and under the trees. Let's talk a little bit about that and what you're doing in your garden space with the layering of plants as they associate with the trees.
The layering of plants is really only being used in one spot, and I'm only using it for visual effect. The reason for that is permaculture, I love, it's absolutely a solid concept, and I recommend it for anybody who wants to do that. However, I find myself feeling too busy to go and maintain the different requirements of each of the levels and being in it as regularly. And so for me, just to keep my head around it so that it doesn't run away from me, I've kind of segmented each of these things. So I'm doing some layering where I can. I'm thinking even of our vegetable garden that we're planting right now. We're planting some beneficial plants and some companion planting that aren't going to, like marigolds, for example, we're planting, or, using like a trap crop to catch some of the bugs so that way they attack, jump onto those things. But in terms of an actual permaculture, it's something where I want to just be able to look and know that everything is working on the trees. For example, we just got rid of a bunch of weeds. We pulled them all out from under the trees because I just want to see that the trees that they're doing okay, and in other areas that are doing okay. I love the idea though. I think it's so solid and sound. I'm just a little bit intimidated at the upkeep of that. So I haven't got a lot of experience putting it into practice.
Well, you don't want more upkeep as the busy gardener?
Again, the busy gardener, this is the gardening. The whole channel is around gardening for the busy person and how you can still do it without. Yeah, I'm not busy gardening. I'm a busy guy who is a gardener. Yeah,
but everything you've explained is you keeping very busy as a gardener.
I know. But, I don't know about that. Some of it is, but I think that fruit trees, this is why I think fruit trees for somebody who is feeling intimidated are fairly, somebody described it like this, that fruit trees are almost like passive income, whereas a vegetable garden is like active income. You set a fruit tree out and you can truly not come back to it for a month.
Yeah.
And it's going to continue doing what it's doing as long as you've got some base things in place, maybe automatic irrigation. Mulch, again, we talked about it a second ago, but I say the mulch covers a multitude of sins. So if there's if you hear anything and you're planting fruit trees, put a 3 to 4 inch layer of wood chip mulch, outside of at least around where the drip line of your tree is. But those are all geared around making things easier for the busy person. Another thing is chickens. When we've got chickens, they're so easy.
Yeah.
They're so easy. And they give a lot back, and you're able to put scraps in there of your, and they come out and there's a lot of beneficial stuff going on. So I think that there's a way where you can do it without having to be very, very time intensive, or at least it's not necessarily urgent, except for harvest time. Harvest time, that's a little bit more time sensitive, but
yeah, absolutely. and I use a number of permaculture principles, but like you, I don't want to work hard if I can avoid it. And so I'm layering around my trees kind of like a permaculture guild would be set up. So I've got my fruit bushes that are near my trees. I'm not putting them right next to it and going to all that work. And I've got raspberries, and I'll be adding this year a lot of the flowers and some of the ground covers. But I completely agree with you. I think one of the issues I have with permaculture is that it takes a lot of work to actually get the most benefits, but I can still do the same thing by layering different levels of trees. And that's the idea for those of you who might be wondering what we're talking about, where we have trees that are the tall plant, and then we have underneath or around those a medium-sized plant, and then we have the small plants that are underneath and around that. And I agree with you. I'm doing it mainly for the visual because I really like that look of the layered plants rather than just having a tree like in an orchard where you've got a tree and then 20 feet later you've got another tree and it just like is a bunch of sticks in the ground with all that, without all the other stuff added.
I'll say this backyard orchard culture really, it's kind of, I don't want to say that it's like permaculture, but because of its high density planting, you get a lot of the benefits. You get a lot of pollination because of how close everything is to begin with. So I don't know if there's kind of a tipping point where it makes sense to, if you've got one tree off in the distance, creating an environment around that so that it's getting some sort of activity. But here everything's close. Everything, a bee can jump from one end to the other and still pollinate.
That's awesome. So Katie's wondering, and I know this is not an easy answer, when pruning, which branches bear fruit first year, second year, and can't remember. And that's the key, is I can never remember either. So with apricots, figs, persimmons, dwarf nectarine, is there any overriding general rule as to which branches are bearing fruit in any given time?
Yeah, this is Katie. That's a wonderful question, and it's something that I've had to be really intentional about paying close attention to. So, before I answer that question, I think anybody listening or watching should pay attention to whether the fruit that you're picking came off of a branch that sprouted this year. You can usually tell when it's a fresh branch, and when your tree is dormant, taking a look at the nodes that are on those branches and what happens to those when it breaks dormancy. Did a flower pop out of it? And if it did, then you know that it was last year's wood that fruited this year. So to answer some of your specific questions, all of the stone fruit generally are going to fruit on, and stone fruit, anything with a pit, so apricot, nectarine, plum, peach. All of those things are going to fruit on last year's wood. So the wood that comes out this year is going to give you fruit next year. A persimmon and fig, those are going to give you fruit on this year's wood. And jujube is another one that fruits on the same year's growth, as I've just observed. Apples take a bit longer. Sometimes it's a fruiting spur that comes out, if I'm remembering right. And so that sometimes is a productive spur for even longer than that.
Yeah, that spur could take years to develop, but then, that's what's so incredible about the trees. There really is no single answer to all of these trees. And, that's where I was prodding you. Of course, you didn't fall for the bait. But the idea is you've got to learn your individual trees and how they do it. And if you can develop those fruiting spurs on an apple tree, 3 or 4 years, and they really are completely different types of branches, you can get fruit from that same spot for decades. That's why espalier works so well with some of these trees, because you've got this small pruned tree and it just keeps producing and keeps producing and keeps producing. But that's another reason why fig doesn't do well in espalier, because you don't have that established growth that's producing it. So it's all about education and making mistakes and realizing that you pruned off the fruiting spur that was it's like, oh, this little stubby branch is in the way. I'll go ahead and cut it off, and then you've lost potential decades of fruit by
It's
that
true.
one cut.
But that's the hard part, and that's where learning. I think knowing which kind of branches fruit and what don't will allow you to refresh the branching on your tree in order to encourage fruiting. So if you've got a fig and you're thinking, oh, it's so pretty, I don't want to cut it off. You're thinking you need to cut it off because you want to refresh the fruiting. Whereas with an apple, if you're prematurely cutting things off before you're getting those fruiting spurs, then you're sabotaging the fruit production. So get an idea of the type of wood material that actually fruits on your tree, and then either preserve the stuff if it fruits in the future, or refresh it, cut it off, and prune it, and give it an opportunity for more to come out.
Yeah, great advice. And so here's an interesting one. And of course, this is one of those answers where it depends, and your answer may be different than mine. What's the thoughts on how far up a trunk to go with mulch? Definitely don't want a volcano, and a volcano is where you just heap up the mulch all the way around the tree so it looks like a volcano. Is there a best mulch for fruit trees? So two different questions. So the first one, I think it depends a lot on where you live and what kind of pests you have. And so if you've got vermin that are crawling underneath your mulch and are going to gnaw on the tree trunk, then you want to keep that mulch away from the tree completely. If you're in an area like mine where I have to fight the moisture concerns, we don't get the rain, we don't get the snow, and I want the moisture in that soil around the tree, I mulch to the trunk, but I take the approach where the mulch closest to my tree trunk is less mulch than the mulch that is 4, 5, 6 feet away that's beyond the drip line. So how do you mulch your trees?
Yeah, this question is an important one, and it scares me a little bit because if you mulch up to the trunk itself, you can create a whole lot of issues for your tree because it traps moisture against the trunk, and you can create a ton of rot and introduce disease. So you always want to pull mulch away from your trunk by a few inches, 6 inches even, and then go out from there. The idea of how far, so I don't even know if the right question is how far up a trunk the mulch should go.
It shouldn't be up a trunk.
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Like,
Yeah.
Don't use the trunk as a thing. There should never be mulch against the trunk of your tree. But I think that 3 to 4 inches is generally going to be good for most people. If you need more insulating effect, then you can go a little bit more than that. But I don't think that 2 feet of mulch is going to be a good idea because again, it's gonna come in and then it's gonna drop way down, and it's easier in that way because of wind or things moving around for all that mulch to end up back in your trunk. So I think 3 to 4 inches up to 6 inches is probably sufficient. And the question of is there a best mulch for fruit trees? Generally, any kind of wood mulch that's of an irregular shape is ideal. So some sort of wood chips. And the reason for that is when it falls, if it's all very uniform and small, it's all going to fall and create a compact layer. And you don't want compact because you want moisture and air to be able to get down to the root system. And so by using an irregular one where you've got small pieces and big pieces and wood chips and sticks, they're all going to create kind of like a lattice on top of each other and it's going to prevent the sun from beating down and baking the soil, but it's going to allow air to still travel through without creating like a caked on layer. So sawdust, somebody had asked me, can I use sawdust? And I thought, no, because you're going to create a particle board on the top of your soil.
Exactly. And I also always encourage wherever you can get for free, wherever you live, if you can find, the free bark, the free wood chips, the free whatever that the tree people can drop off at your yard. I use chip drop, and free is better than having to pay for some, and I think you've probably seen those ads too, where, you can buy this mulch is supposed to be super incredible, and
don't fall for it.
Doesn't make any difference. Don't fall.
You're not using it for its nutritional value. The only caveat to that is if you want a specific look, chip drop or one of these arborists is not going to give you a finished looking product. There are going to be leaves mixed into it and some of those things. But yeah, get in touch with this is where using something like chip drop works. But I also think that getting in touch with local tree trimming companies is helpful because you can talk to them. Hey, what kind of wood are you bringing? And you can find out from them. And so I did a video on this actually too, how to get mulch for free. And so
Oh,
really looks at because I paid for the first few. I paid for an actual company, like a landscaping company, to bring 30 yards or whatever it was, some crazy amount of mulch. And it was beautiful. It looked gorgeous. But then that breaks down and you've got to replenish it. And I thought, I don't want to pay another $500. And here somebody was willing to just for free come and drop it off. I felt like I got a cheat code or something.
yeah, and it doesn't really matter what the material is, and yes, if you can look at it and you're the only one that is looking at it that really has a vote in the scenario. But I like the look of that raw wood chip around my trees, and especially when you get it for free, it's like, yeah, score on multiple levels. Now here's a great question. Shows that Greg has done some research. I have a cedar tree in my yard that gets cedar apple rust galls every year. Should I avoid planting apple trees?
So I'm not familiar with cedar apple rust gall.
Okay, so the situation is, and I'm not sure if you have a similar situation with other trees in California, but there are certain pests that go from one tree to the other tree. And so the cedar apple rust galls, and the gall is actually just a structure that the tree forms where the insect has laid the egg. And then it emerges and it moves from the cedar tree to the apple tree.
Oh, nice.
And then it causes problems with the apple tree. And so, this is one of those where I would not necessarily say don't grow apple trees. Just be aware that your apple trees are probably going to have a pest problem. And so now what you have to do is deal with the traps and some of those other things that you might have to deal with to deal with the insect that's traveling back and forth from winter in one tree to summer in the other tree. So do you have any of those kind of insect problems where one thing you're doing in one part of your garden affects what you're doing in another part of the garden, and therefore you're choosing your trees to circumvent that?
It's the second half of that was going to be, while I'm not familiar with this particular issue, I am familiar with other issues. And we've really been hit with a lot of different type of pest pressure the last year and a half, 2 years. And so, for example, our pear tree has fire blight, the 4-in-1. And I've made a video on that too, because we try to get out ahead of it. And so there is an element of just looking at what's going on. Our passion fruit vine has scale insect that just decimated 40 feet of beautiful passion fruit vine, and to the degree that we're not even going to replant it because it was so difficult to spot and so difficult to eradicate. So if there are measures, it's kind of a big answer. So I'm going to just give an unsatisfying small one.
Okay.
Look at what the interventions are for that particular type of pest and decide if that's something that you want to take on. If you want apple trees, more than you want the easy life of not having to deal with those pests, and plant apple trees. But if you don't want to deal with that pest every year, then I wouldn't. If you know that there's an issue and you've got cedars that are there that are causing this issue, just weigh that. You're going to have to decide if this is something you're going to want to be on top of.
Yeah, and I agree, and that's why I said some of the insect controls are relatively easy. It's a trap, it's a spray. Sometimes you might need to use a systemic pesticide depending on how intense, but absolutely, it's a balance of how much work you want to put into it to decide.
And how bad do you want it? It's almost like the citrus in 5B. How bad do you want citrus? You can make it work.
That's right. Yeah. Yeah, I could add heat to a super tall greenhouse and have lights and grow citrus if I wanted to.
In the snow.
it's not worth it. So Amy's asking a common question I get as well, is if there's any downside to pine mulch. And most of my mulch is actually pine. We've got a lot of pines in the area, firs, a lot of conifers. And so that's the mulch I'm using. with absolutely no concern about that mulch. And so this ties in as well with maybe in your area eucalyptus. So what are your thoughts on using some of these wood chip mulches that people think are harmful, but those of us that use them recognize they really aren't that harmful?
I'm pretty agnostic as far as this stuff. I think the most wood chip mulches, as they're being used, do not pose an issue. The points where they start posing more of an issue have to do with if you're mixing them into the soil. If you're using them as some sort of amendment, now you're changing the nature of the soil itself, not just dealing with whatever breaks down from it on the top surface. So if you're tilling this type of, whatever you're tilling into the soil is going to change the composition of the soil. Whereas if you're just layering it on the top, those things, as they break down to their smallest forms, I don't think there's as much variance. I don't think you need to worry about it.
Yeah, and it's like with black walnut, has the juglone chemical, and people are concerned about the pine bark lowering the pH, and the eucalyptus also has some allelopathic properties. But when used as a mulch, exactly as you said, it's not an issue. If you till it into the soil and rob nitrogen and all those other things that could happen, it could be an issue. But I'll take anything that's free and doesn't look too bad to help keep the moisture in my soil. It's one of those things that I'm combating. We just had in March the third driest March on record here in my part of Colorado. And so even though we got some snow, it wasn't the water kind of snow that it melts, it's good. It was just, dry flakes. And so mulch is critical for some of us to even have a garden. And I'm not going to be picky about what it is that I'm putting on my garden if I can avoid it. Joni's saying, anyone have success at getting rid of codling moth on apple trees without the expensive traps?
I'm not on my apples. I've not dealt with codling moth. So how are the traps prohibitively expensive?
I don't know. I don't have codling moth here either. And so I think the issue I've seen is, around your vegetable plants, if you've got some pests, you can just put a yellow sticky trap and the problem goes away, or at least is greatly reduced. But when you have a big problem with like the codling moth, you need to put up multiple traps. And so while the cost of a single trap might not be that much, and I honestly don't know how much they are either, I think it's more the quantity that you have to do that I suppose could get expensive. But I don't have another solution. That's just one of those things like we were talking about earlier with the cedar and the apple. If you want the apples, you've got to do what you have to do.
Yeah, how bad do you want apple pie this year?
Exactly.
Yeah.
And so talking about watering, since we've been talking about mulch, you had a recent video where you did your drip irrigation system, which looked like it was a massive project. But that was more for your vegetable garden area, right?
That's right.
And so tell me your thoughts on drip irrigation for fruit trees.
Oh my goodness. Let me count the ways. Yeah. Listen, this is irrigating your vegetables automatically is one of the joys of life, because otherwise you're going to be out there. The amount of water that needs to be put on trees, not at any given point for it to actually go down and have some sort of effect down at the roots, you got to put a bunch of sustained water on your fruit trees. And this is pretty true across the board. Some are more water hungry than others, but I think that a drip system, because it's delivering a lot of water, but over a long period of time, so it's delivering it slowly, gives an opportunity to prevent runoff. So it's going to allow that water to actually go down into the soil, down by the roots, and allow there to be moisture in the soil. I think drip irrigation, we need to talk about irrigation actually for a second. So drip irrigation is absolutely the way to go. I use an overhead sprinkler emitter, largely because when I fertilize and I use a granular fertilizer, that sits on top of the mulch, and I want the irrigation to land on top of the fertilizer and drive it down. Some people also use the emitters that go underneath the mulch, just the ones that are the drip tubing. I don't use that because I want the effect of the water hitting the mulch and taking it down. And we don't have enough rainy days here to justify that. Although it's been raining for like a month straight. So
That's right.
But when it comes to irrigation, I'm going to talk really quickly about fruit trees. They're not flowers. They're not lettuce. Even there's a case to be made about watering irregularly. People generally overwater their fruit trees. If you have an issue, because and again, it's one of these intuitive things where we see it starting to droop and we think, oh no, I've got to go and water it. And so you've watered it for the 4th day in a row, and the tree is drowning. And so it's trying to show you that it's drowning, and you think, oh no, I need to water it more. Oh no, the tree died. And it's because it drowned. Trees, generally speaking, especially if you've got a mulch layer that's leveling out the humidity levels in the soil, can be watered, even in our hot climate here, can be watered once a week. Even in the summertime, we sometimes will do twice a week. Again, especially for the subtropical stuff, so that the avocados, they do need a little bit more water. But outside of that, especially if it's an established tree and you've got a decent mulch layer, watering your tree once a week with a deep irrigation, and I mean watering it for a couple of hours, maybe putting on 30, 40 gallons a tree. Again, depending on the size, but just keep this in mind, is like watering an established fruit tree once a week is usually enough. And this is a big reason why people who plant a tree in their lawn, their tree often dies. I was on a run. There's a house in my neighborhood. They planted 2 citrus trees in their lawn, in the middle of it. And so on my regular run, I was watching this develop. And over time, I just saw the trees do this, and all of a sudden they didn't have any leaves anymore. And pretty soon they were removed because they died, because they were getting watered every single day or every couple of days.
Yeah, that's my biggest issue, I think, with the drip irrigation is people think it makes it easier. And so they put it on a timer and they set the schedule, and they're watering constantly every day for 15 minutes or whatever it happens to be. I've always been an advocate, even in the vegetable garden, of not watering unless the plants need water. And the way you do that is you stick your finger in the soil and see if the plants need water at all. And that's why I mentioned earlier, in August, I knew my soil was still moist underneath my mulch, because even though I got in the habit of watering my fruit trees weekly, as you say, I would still pull aside the mulch to see if the soil was moist and how far down that moisture went. And even when, in August here in Colorado, we're 7, maybe 8% humidity.
Oh, wow.
And, I mean, it's crazy dry. And there were weeks that I would go every 2 or 3 weeks between watering, because the mulch is so effective at holding it in, even with that dry humidity. So, I'm glad you said that. The type of emitter and whether it's underneath or on top of, those are all considerations when putting in a system. And so the lines, y'all need to check out the Cameron's video, because I like to get out and hand water. I like to hand water my fruit trees. I like standing at the tree for a long time, just soaking in nature. And I saw how much work you did for your drip irrigation. It's like, yeah, that's why I like to hand water.
It was an investment in time. One reason why it took as long as it did is I would try to be really thoughtful about how I was setting it up, because I knew
it was a great design.
And it's actually in practice been really functional. So I'm happy that I did it. But yeah, it was quite a bear to lay out drip irrigation. But I will say this though, when it comes to irrigating a vegetable garden, you need a lot more tubing to make that happen.
Sure.
A fruit tree, you literally run one main line and then just run 1/4-inch lines off of it to the tree. So that's a way different proposition. And it doesn't have to be exact, because I'm not using, so the tubing I'm using is not a emitter tubing. It's just a mainline tubing that I'm running off of. So drip system for fruit trees, way easier than drip system for a vegetable garden.
Yeah, that's a good point. And that's another reason I don't like to use the drip irrigation in my vegetable garden, because every year is different. Yeah. And, I'm not planting the exact same plants in the same beds, not because of rotation, but just because I'm always trying something new. And I just got tired of having to plug holes and punch new holes to match the plants for the next season. And it's very effective. Don't get me wrong, everybody. If you like drip irrigation, it can be a great way to save water. especially for those of us that need to be saving water. But I like the just get up close and personal to your plants, and also not the initial outlay to put in the system. I have thought about doing like a layout for most of my beds. My vegetable beds are 4 foot by 8 foot, where I would have my central water line with the sidelines and the emitter set up for like tomatoes. Mm-hmm. And then at the end of the season, just take that whole irrigation system, put it in my shed, and then the next year, whatever bed I was going to use for tomatoes, just lay that thing on.
I love that. You know, again, this is one of those things you're trading a lot of future work. You know, or let me back it up. You're trading some of the initial outlay of time and effort and expense to set yourself up for a longer period of time of not having to do any of that stuff.
Exactly.
I did this thing in my vegetable garden because I don't want to all of a sudden miss a day of watering and everything gets fried. It needs to be on an irrigation thing, or else we're going to come back to heartache when I thought you were watering it today.
Yeah.
So
total heartache.
Bit of it's an investment. It's almost like training somebody to do something that you know how to do well. It's hard and it takes a bunch of time, but 2 years from now, you're going to be glad that you did it, generally speaking. But I like watering. I like hand watering plants. I just find that as stuff gets busy, then it's all of a sudden a pressure because it's going to die if I don't do it. And that's what I wanted to alleviate.
Yeah. I will admit, I've got my normal routine where I get up in the morning and I go out and I water and it all works. But if I want to travel or if something comes up, then there's a turmoil as to, well, now I got to water the day before extra, or exactly. Got to get up early and go out. So yeah, there's some benefits to not having to work so hard. And so do you have some favorite nurseries that you get your trees from? Moondust is wondering about where they can get a Honeycrisp apple. And I've actually grown Honeycrisp apple from a couple different sources. I think Stark Brothers was the last one that I got mine from. But where do you get your trees?
Most of my trees have been purchased at local nurseries. And so there was an old one that was an old nursery, Mount Fuji Garden Center. And so I went and bought a bunch of trees from them years ago when I established my orchard. I like specific growers for deciduous trees. I like Dave Wilson Nursery for the trees that they've got. They also have some unique ones that aren't available through other nurseries. And those trees are usually made available all around here, at least on the West Coast. Most of the local nurseries will carry that sort of Dave Wilson plants. But online stuff works as well. If there's a particular cultivar that is not available locally, then ordering it from an online nursery like Stark Brothers makes a ton of sense. I will say that Dave Wilson Nursery, I think it's just davewilson.com, they have a where to buy feature. So if you find a cultivar that you want, you can see which nurseries in which state ordered it. And so then you can call that nursery ahead of time. And I've done that when I've been looking for a specific variety that I've needed as a pollinator. I'm thinking of my Royal Crimson Cherry, for example, that I needed. And I was able to find the one that had it. I was able to call them and they went out and checked and they said, yeah, we've got 3 of them. And so I knew exactly where to go instead of hunting around.
Nice. I didn't realize they had that. That's a great option.
Super convenient.
Cool. Greg, thank you for that super chat. I appreciate it. If I want to grow dwarf apple trees and prune to keep small, what minimum tree height can I expect to keep it to while still getting a good harvest?
So I'm going to just imagine some of the questions you're asking. So when you say keep it small, what I mean by keep it small is keep it no higher than I can reach.
Yeah.
So that's small because the eventual height of an apple, even if it's dwarf, is 18 feet, we were mentioning earlier in the thing. And so small is keeping it at 8 feet, which is where I can roughly reach and prune. That said, I have an Anna apple that's in the front that has a naturally compact habit that gives me 20 fruit. It's tiny though. It's small. It doesn't get a lot of sun where I have it planted. So to answer that question a little bit, you can get a good harvest. A tree that is no higher than you can reach, if it's the only tree in its own planting. In other words, if you didn't do a multi-planting where you've got 3 different kinds of trees, you can easily get more apples than you can eat from a tree that's no higher that you can reach. So
absolutely. Well, I've grown trees that I needed a step ladder, but that's exactly what I did. I would prune. I didn't mind the tree growing 8 feet or 9 feet tall because just outside the door I had a little step ladder I could pull out and just give myself that extra reach. But I'm not going to get on a 12-foot ladder to harvest. Some of us of a certain age don't want to fall and break a hip and not be able to garden again. So, yeah, I agree completely. It's keeping it whatever is manageable. I don't necessarily think of it as small, but as manageable is really the way to approach it.
I want to add quickly to that. All of these pruning methods that we're talking about, these are creating trade-offs. You would get the most fruit from a tree if you let it grow to its eventual height and be this massive thing. But because you don't want that, you're going to lose some fruiting. And so you're just trying to find that middle ground that is going to work best for you and what you're trying to accomplish.
And if you've got kids or grandkids, sometimes climbing in the tree to harvest is a lot of fun.
That's true.
I had cousins of my father who lived in the San Joaquin Valley and had a peach orchard. And I can remember being a kid and crawling into those trees at harvest time before the trucks came through because my grandmother made peach jam every year. And so it was up to me to climb into the tree and harvest the peaches. And those are great memories, being a kid climbing in the peach trees and pulling off the peaches. So that's why I say it's manageable more than size. It's what your intended purpose is for that tree that will help determine whatever the appropriate height is for you.
Can I make a comment about just pruning in general?
Sure.
I've done a number of videos on pruning, showing the technique, because that was the thing that was the most intimidating to me. Because the idea of cutting a limb off of a living thing seems like being a barbarian. I even had somebody castigate me on one of my videos because I did a heading cut. And she says, you're a butcher. Look at the smile on your face. I'm unsubscribing or whatever. And I thought, we think that it's cutting off an arm or a leg, but trees are designed to grow back from this sort of stuff. And, if wind knocks things over or if another branch knocks it, they're designed to grow new branching. And on a lot of these trees, especially on fruit trees, the way that you keep a fruit tree productive is by pruning. And so a fruit tree is not a person. It's equipped to deal with limb loss. It's a very natural process that happens. A branch gets overloaded with fruit, it's going to break off. So you're pruning to avoid that sort of stuff. You're kind of managing that in advance. So try to be brave. It takes a lot of bravery to do it. And once you're 1,000 cuts in, you realize nothing happened and your trees are the happier for it. But it is a really intimidating thing. I think pruning out of anything is the most intimidating prospect. And people will usually they will under prune and they will under thin their fruit also, because that's also a sad prospect.
Yeah, I agree with you. I did a video when I was setting up my fruit trees and pruning to get a particular shape of the tree. And, as you know, whether you're going with the vase shape or a central leader, different fruit trees do better. And I got the same kind of comments as I was making heading cuts. Yeah. And I was making heading cuts specifically to get the buds to appear, to give me the scaffold, the future branches that heading cut. And a heading cut, for those of you who don't know, is you've got your nice little young tree and you basically just lop off the top. And it's like cutting the head off, and it's painful to do. It just doesn't feel
It looks
right.
crazy.
It looks crazy, but it stimulates those buds to now send out those side branches, which is what you want if you're trying to shape a tree to get the best future growth of the tree. And so completely agree with you, and it actually plays in with Astonine 85's comment where earlier we said if you got a tree and you need to hack it too much, start over again. I think with this question, if you prune too much over time, will that kill a normal tree? I think if you were to prune too much all at once, it could kill a tree. But based on what you just said, over time, it really isn't a problem that's going to kill a tree.
Yeah, not at all. There might be some weird circumstance where that would initiate something, but generally speaking, over time, It is. It's almost like coming to a stop in a car. You know, if you go from 0 to 70 over 10 seconds, that's reasonable. If you go 0 or 70 to 0, you know, by hitting a brick wall, that's a whole different story. So the overtime is really the critical piece with that.
Absolutely. And Jay Dixon's one of my fabulous moderators. Has been putting up links as we've been talking about some of your videos.
Thanks,
and
Jay.
So if you are joining us late, Cameron is the Busy Gardener on YouTube. Has some great videos, a lot of wonderful fruit tree videos, and I've yet to find anything that you say that I disagree with. So I think that's an important factor. I always like talking to gardeners who have the same basic understanding of how we do things, and I think you've just got some fantastic videos, and it's not all fruit trees. And so fruit trees, the videos you have that have done the best are on the fruit trees, and you do have a focus on fruit trees. But let's briefly talk as we get close to the end on the rest of your garden, the vegetable gardening. What kind of things do you like to do outside of the fruit trees as just a regular backyard gardener?
Gardener. Yeah, we had a small raised square foot garden that we had built years and years ago, but it was in a non-ideal location, and so we liked growing lots of different things in there, a ton of variety, peas and eggplant and zucchini and tomatoes, all of those things. Flowers, cut flowers, we've loved it. But then we expanded and we went from having like 90 square feet to 900 square feet. And we finished that project a little over a year ago. I wasn't able to continue. A wrench got thrown in it last year because my dad passed away around this time last year. And so
sorry to hear that.
Yeah, that obviously just upended everything for us in a lot of ways. We still planted a number of things in that area. Tomatoes, we use the Florida weave system to keep these indeterminate tomatoes upright, getting a ton of sun. Our peppers were looking great. And so this year we've got a much more ambitious growing. We're actually have all 900 square feet planned. So we've got a whole panacea of things that we're growing. We love to grow like butternuts but all the squashes we like. We love spaghetti squash. We've got a large area for that. We're growing corn. We've got a large pea and bean area. We've got a number of different tomatoes, a number of different peppers, from sweet to very, very hot.
Nice.
And so we're excited about cantaloupe. Something we're excited about trying this year is to grow the vining things like cucumbers and cantaloupe on a trellis. Is like a trellis, but using like a sheep panel bent in a semicircle and just having it grow vertically. And when we were doing our square foot garden, we were using that vertical space pretty well by using some sort of trellising. And so a lot of the vining stuff was going up there. And so now we're doing it with a more rigid structure than just nylon. So we've got a lot.
Nice. And it sounds like you're having fun with it, which is important. The cucumbers do great growing like that. I just love growing my cucumbers in the greenhouse. It was a dome greenhouse that was 25 feet tall.
Wow.
And had twine coming down from the top. And I would grow my cucumbers 12 and 14 feet tall. I did have to use a ladder to harvest those cucumbers because I wanted to see how tall they can get. And so with a tall hoop like that, you should easily, depending on the variety you're growing, of course, it's kind of fun to walk underneath an arch like that and just reach up and pluck a cucumber off of it like you would be plucking an apple off an apple tree.
I've noticed the stuff that we grew last year, like our cantaloupe and cucumber that were growing just on the ground, there was more pest damage on the ground, and it was evident that it was where it was making contact with the soil is where a lot of that was taking place. And so having that off of the ground, I think, is also going to be beneficial.
Absolutely. That's a big advantage to it. Colorado Bird Nerd, thank you for that super chat, and you're very welcome. Another amazing live. Greatest way to start my week. I just subscribed to the Busy Gardeners YouTube as well.
Thanks, Bird Nerd.
So that's fantastic. I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of people that are going to be bouncing over to your channels. It's been a great chat today. It's always nice when we can get together and share our stories and what we're doing and be excited about it. You've got a great energy. I know people love that as well. Urban Chicken Mama is wondering, I sprayed copper fungicide on my trees, then it rained. Now they're blooming. What can I do?
I would I would, if they're just breaking bud, I would go and give them another spray. The nice thing is the fact that you did the fungicide to begin with would have killed off a lot of the any fungus that was growing there. So you did probably a bunch of the work when you did that. It's not something that needs to remain on there. You're kind of treating the tree, and so you may just retreat it if you want. You may also just keep a lookout for it. The fungicide can be sprayed mid-season as well. So even if you're getting some initial, like I'm noticed yesterday that my Spice Z Nectaplum has some peach leaf curl. And so I'm going to go now that I've noticed it, and I'm going to go and spray that on that tree. And so that the way the new foliage that comes out of those new branches are going to have unaffected, it's going to be largely unaffected. We did that last year with our nectarine as well. We saw where there was some need for it. And then when we went and sprayed, and it kind of alleviated that for the future growth that came out of it.
Great. And so let's go ahead and finish with this idea of fungal diseases or bacterial diseases or any type of disease. How do you approach if you have let's start with this easy. A single tree becomes infected. How do you approach that as opposed to maybe you're starting to see a trend with multiple trees? What kind of approaches do you take?
Well, I try to create as little intervention as I can. Because there's often a trade-off. If you treat one thing, sometimes it'll affect another. And so I try to I want the ecosystem of the orchard to take care of itself as much as I can. I don't want to spray pesticides if I can help it. I don't want to spray fungicides if I can help it. So where you see an issue, I think just deal with it. It again depends on the infection. I mean, if it's something that is systemic and that is, working its way down a tree like fire blight, for example, you need to jump on that right away and you need to get that material out of there. And if it's something that's just peach leaf curl, which is largely superficial, it will affect a tree over time. That's a little less serious. And so I'm going to be a little bit less intense about that than I will about something that's going to go down and kill an entire tree, because a tree for me is a longer term proposition.
Right. Good answer. Good answer. Yeah, I do the same thing. If I can avoid spraying, if I see this is I think a good justification for getting out in your garden on a regular basis and paying attention to what's going on. Because if you can catch the blight early and chop off that branch, you may no longer have that issue in your garden. But you've got to be there and see it, which is why the put everything on a schedule and walk away, I don't think is the best method for gardening.
It's low maintenance. It's not no maintenance. And I think if you're growing a tree, if you really don't want to do anything in your orchard or garden, then just buy your produce from the store. It's okay. On the video front, so the channel has largely been about fruit trees. That's what got me initially excited. But as you've got these raised beds, we're creating a lot more content on the raised beds, starting vegetables, planting vegetables, caring for vegetables, different ways to do things in there. And so be on the lookout for those. So we've got a huge library, around 200 videos of fruit tree material, but we have a lot more garden material that's being produced and coming out as well.
Fantastic. So I'll give another shout out to the Busy Gardener channel. Definitely check it out. They're very well done videos, and I'm all about the education, and your videos are very educational. I mean, yeah, you've got the tour kind of stuff. Here's what's happening in the garden. Those are always fun to do. But even I, who know a thing or two about gardening, am learning from watching your video. So I think they really can be beneficial for the average gardener. It's great having you on today.
This is great. I really enjoyed it, and I loved all the questions. Talking about this stuff, it feels like we're just a large group of people now having a conversation instead of just you and I.
Absolutely. And, I always start by talking about this global audience, and we really do. This group that is watching on Mondays, we've got regular viewers in Germany and Belgium and Canada and New Zealand and Chile and Australia and many, many other places. So it's not just you in Southern California and me in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado who are thinking the same things. Some of these questions are coming from people far removed where we live, and I think that's just one of the fantastic things about the gardening community.
It's such a great community. It's for all the strife that can be found on YouTube in the comment sections. It's been amazing to just see the positivity in this. largely, like by a long shot, it's a very, very positive, good thing. We're all of us struggling in the same way, and it's a good struggle to have.
That's right. And so Tony O'Neill from the Simplified Gardening channel, of course, chimed in, being in Wales, and Jay Dixon, the moderator, is in Canada, and then Tron is actually, I saw Tron on earlier as well from Vietnam. So it's just incredible. And
Alaska from Chile.
there you go. See? So, and then of course there's lots of individual states that are represented. So you've been exposed to a truly global audience, and I hope a lot of these viewers are going to your channel. Thank you so much, Cameron, and maybe we could have you on the show again sometime.
I'd love it. This has been a lot of fun. Thanks, Scott.
Okay, well, enjoy your time, and I'll go ahead and let you go back to your normal day, and I'll go ahead and finish by saying thank you to all of you. This really is a fantastic audience, and check out Cameron's channel. I'll be back next Monday, same time, same place, and guess what we'll talk about? My guess is it's going to be gardening. Hope you have a wonderful week. I'll see you then. I'm Gardener Scott. Enjoy gardening.